The invisible threat. How toxic people quietly damage your health. There is a kind of danger that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't crash into your life like an accident or scream like an alarm. It settles in quietly, politely, almost invisibly. It shows up as exhaustion you can't explain, as mornings where your body feels 10 years older than it should, as anxiety that hums in the background, even on good days, as a sense that something is wrong, but you can't quite name what it is. And here's the most unsettling part. For millions of people, this danger isn't coming from their diet, their lack of exercise, or even their genetics. It's coming from someone in their life. A partner, a parent, a boss, a family member, someone they talk to regularly, someone they may even love. Most people are taught to believe that stress comes from work, deadlines, finances, or responsibilities. But there is a far more corrosive form of stress, one that medicine, psychology, and society still struggle to fully acknowledge. Relational stress. Chronic, toxic, narcissistic, relational stress. This is the kind of stress that never lets your nervous system stand down. The kind that keeps your body in a constant state of vigilance. The kind that doesn't end when the conversation is over, because the next interaction is always looming. People living inside these dynamics often don't describe themselves as abused. They don't use dramatic language. Instead, they say things like, "I'm just tired all the time. I don't feel like myself anymore. I'm always on edge. I feel like I'm slowly disappearing." What's shocking is how often their bodies begin to fall apart before their minds fully understand what's happening. Headaches become migraines. Digestive issues become chronic. Sleep becomes fragmented and shallow. The immune system weakens. Inflammation rises. Healing slows down. Doctors run tests. Results come back normal. You're told to manage stress, get more rest, try mindfulness, maybe exercise more. But no one asks the most important question. Who are you emotionally exposed to every day? Toxic and narcissistic relationships function like living next to a factory leaking invisible fumes. You don't see the poison, but your body absorbs it. Day after day. Year after year. In these relationships, safety is unpredictable. Affection is conditional. Reality is constantly questioned. You're never fully relaxed, because part of you is always scanning for the next emotional shift, the next criticism, the next explosion, the next withdrawal. Your body interprets this accurately as danger, and when danger never ends, the body adapts in ways that slowly destroy health. This is why people often feel worse at home than at work. Why weekends bring dread instead of relief. Why holidays feel heavy instead of joyful. Why the body tightens before certain phone calls or visits. This isn't imagination. This isn't weakness. This isn't being too sensitive. This is biology responding to chronic threat. One of the most haunting patterns clinicians see is this. People who have struggled with health issues for years, sometimes decades, begin to improve when a toxic relationship is removed or significantly limited. Sleep improves, pain lessens, energy returns, healing accelerates, not because the person suddenly became disciplined or positive, but because their nervous system finally felt safe enough to rest. The tragedy is that many people never connect the dots. They blame themselves. They push harder. They stay longer. They tell themselves that relationships are just hard, that this is what adulthood looks like, that they need to be more patient, more understanding, more resilient. Meanwhile, their bodies are paying the price. What makes this especially dangerous is how normalized it is. Society rewards endurance, loyalty, silence. We celebrate people who stick it out, who don't complain, who sacrifice themselves for family, marriage, or work. But the body does not reward self-betrayal. The body keeps track of every swallowed emotion, every dismissed feeling, every moment you were made to doubt your reality. It records it in muscle tension, hormone dysregulation, immune responses, and inflammation. This is not just emotional pain. It is a slow, cumulative physiological injury. And here's the truth most people never hear until it's almost too late. No amount of yoga, supplements, therapy, or positive thinking can fully counteract a toxic relational environment. You cannot out-meditate chronic emotional threat. You cannot out-exercise being psychologically unsafe. You cannot heal in the same environment that is making you sick. This realization is often terrifying, because it means the problem isn't just out there. In the world, it may be sitting across from you at the dinner table. It may be the person whose approval you've been chasing. It may be the voice that makes you feel small, confused, or invisible. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. But before we go any further, if this kind of content resonates with you, if you've ever felt that quiet sense that something in your life is draining you in ways you can't explain, make sure to subscribe to this channel. Supporting the channel helps us continue creating honest, in-depth conversations about narcissism, trauma, and healing topics that too many people suffer through in silence. Now, let me ask you something important. Quick question for you. Which do you think damages health more over time? A. Being alone? B. Being in a toxic relationship? Comment A or B below. Your answer and your reasons matter more than you may realize. Why this is a public health crisis no one is talking about. If you were to walk into almost any doctor's office in the United States today, you would hear the same familiar questions. How is your sleep? What does your diet look like? Do you exercise? Do you smoke? How much alcohol do you drink? Are you under stress? These questions are not wrong. They are essential. But they are also incomplete, in a way that is quietly costing people their health, and in some cases, their lives. Because there is a critical question that is almost never asked, not in primary care, not in specialist visits, not even, often, in therapy. That question is, who are you emotionally living with? When Emily began seeking medical help for her worsening health, no one asked her about the emotional climate of her relationship. Her symptoms were treated as isolated problems. Migraines were neurological. Digestive issues were gastrointestinal. Fatigue was stress-related. Anxiety was psychological. Each symptom was placed in its own box, addressed in its own silo. What no one saw was the system those symptoms were emerging from. This is the defining blind spot of modern healthcare. We treat the body as if it exists independently from the relational environment it inhabits. Public health campaigns do an excellent job warning us about sugar, smoking, sedentary lifestyles, and poor sleep hygiene. Entire industries exist around optimizing nutrition, movement, and longevity. Yet one of the most powerful determinants of health remains largely unexamined: chronic exposure to psychologically unsafe relationships. This omission is not accidental. It is cultural. American culture deeply normalizes relational distress. We are taught that relationships are supposed to be hard, that marriage requires endurance, that family must be tolerated no matter the cost, that difficult bosses are simply part of professional life. We celebrate grit, sacrifice, and loyalty, often without asking who is paying the physiological price for those virtues. In this context, people like Emily don't see themselves as being harmed. They see themselves as failing to cope. They push harder. They blame their bodies. They internalize the idea that if they were stronger, calmer, more patient, more emotionally intelligent, things would feel better. This self-blame is reinforced by systems that lack a language for relational trauma. Healthcare is designed to address discrete variables: blood pressure, cholesterol, blood sugar, tumor markers. But relational toxicity doesn't show up neatly on a lab report. There is no blood test for chronic invalidation. No scan that detects years of walking on eggshells. No diagnostic code for living with someone who slowly erodes your sense of safety. So the suffering becomes invisible. Even mental health systems often struggle here. Therapy models frequently focus inward. How do you feel? What are your triggers? How can you regulate better? While these questions are valuable, they can unintentionally obscure a crucial reality. Sometimes the problem is not how a person is reacting, but what they are reacting to. When therapy ignores power dynamics, entitlement, manipulation, and chronic invalidation. It risks pathologizing the survivor instead of naming the environment. This is where the concept of stress becomes dangerously vague. Stress is treated as a personal management issue rather than an environmental exposure. You are encouraged to meditate inside the fire rather than step away from it. What makes this a public health crisis rather than a collection of individual stories is scale. Millions of people are embedded in relational systems that keep their nervous systems in a constant state of alert. These are not rare, extreme cases. They are marriages, families, workplaces, and social circles that look functional from the outside and are corrosive on the inside. And the health consequences are not subtle. Chronic stress of this kind alters immune function, increases inflammation, worsens cardiovascular risk, impairs healing, and exacerbates chronic illness. It doesn't just make people unhappy, it makes them sick. And when illness becomes chronic, expensive, and disabling, it stops being a private matter. It becomes a societal burden. Yet because we don't name the cause, we never address it upstream. Instead, we prescribe medications to manage symptoms while leaving the source untouched. We recommend lifestyle changes that are impossible to sustain in unsafe emotional environments. We tell people to rest while their nervous systems are never allowed to relax. This gap creates a cruel paradox. The very people who are most in need of rest, recovery, and support are often the ones least able to access it, because the relational systems draining them also demand their compliance, silence, and self-sacrifice. Emily did everything she was told. She exercised. She ate carefully. She tried therapy. She practiced mindfulness. None of it addressed the underlying reality that her body was living in a state of chronic emotional threat. And until that reality was acknowledged, nothing truly changed. Public health does not just mean preventing disease. It means creating conditions where health is possible. That includes clean water, safe housing, and access to care. But it must also include psychological safety in close relationships. When society fails to recognize toxic relational exposure as a legitimate health risk, individuals are left to navigate it alone. They doubt themselves. They stay longer. They get sicker. This is why awareness matters. Not to label or demonize, but to name what has gone unnamed for far too long. Because when a health risk remains invisible, it remains unaddressed. And when it remains unaddressed, people like Emily continue to suffer quietly, wondering why their bodies are breaking down, unaware that the environment they are living in is the very thing keeping them unwell. This is not just a personal issue. It is a systemic one. And until we are willing to talk about it openly, honestly, and without minimizing its impact, this crisis will continue unseen, untreated, and devastating in its reach. Trauma that lives in the body. From cortisol to chronic illness, trauma does not always announce itself as a memory. Sometimes, it arrives as a symptom, a racing heart that appears out of nowhere, a stomach that clenches before a conversation even begins, a body that refuses to rest, even when exhaustion is overwhelming. For Emily, trauma never looked like a single catastrophic event. There was no obvious before and after. No clear moment where everything shattered. Instead, it unfolded quietly, biologically, inside her body long before she had language for what was happening. This is one of the most misunderstood truths about trauma. It does not require violence to be real, and it does not live only in the mind. Trauma lives in the nervous system. When a person is exposed to chronic emotional unpredictability, criticism without warning, affection that disappears without explanation, constant vigilance around another person's moods, the body adapts. Not emotionally at first. Biologically, the brain's threat detection system becomes hypersensitive. The amygdala stays alert. The body releases cortisol, adrenaline, and other stress hormones, not for minutes or hours, but day after day. What was meant to be a short-term survival response becomes a long-term operating system. Cortisol is not the villain it's often portrayed as. In healthy bursts, it saves lives. It mobilizes energy. It sharpens focus. But cortisol was never meant to be constantly elevated. When cortisol never comes down, the body pays a price. Sleep becomes fragmented because the nervous system refuses to stand down. The immune system weakens because energy is diverted toward survival rather than repair. Inflammation increases, quietly damaging tissues over time. Digestion suffers because the body deprioritizes anything not essential for immediate safety. This is why trauma often shows up first as physical illness. Emily didn't connect her autoimmune symptoms to her emotional environment. Why would she? No one told her to. Instead, she blamed her body. She blamed aging. She blamed stress. She blamed herself. What she didn't realize was that her body was doing exactly what it was designed to do: responding to threat. Interpersonal trauma is uniquely damaging because it is relational and inescapable. Unlike a car accident or a natural disaster, you cannot simply recover and move on when the source of danger is a person you live with, work for, or depend on. The body cannot resolve what the mind is forced to tolerate, so the trauma stays active. Over time, this state of chronic activation begins to affect nearly every system in the body. Cardiovascular health declines as blood pressure and heart rate remain elevated. Hormonal systems fall out of balance. The gut microbiome, now understood to be deeply connected to mood and immunity, becomes disrupted. Many people develop conditions that medicine labels as idiopathic, meaning there is no clear cause. Fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, migraines, irritable bowel syndrome, autoimmune flares, persistent pain. What is often missing from the conversation is not treatment, but context. The body does not separate emotional stress from physical stress. It does not distinguish between a predator in the wild and emotional danger at home. It only knows whether it is safe. When safety is absent, the body remains in defense mode. One of the most heartbreaking aspects of this process is how often survivors are dismissed. Because their symptoms don't follow clean patterns, they are told it's anxiety, or stress, or psychosomatic, as if the word psychological somehow means imaginary. But psychosomatic does not mean unreal. It means the psyche and soma, the mind and body, are inseparable. Emily began to notice something strange long before she fully understood her situation. Her symptoms flared after arguments. Her pain intensified after periods of emotional tension. Her body reacted before she consciously registered distress. This is not coincidence. It is conditioning. The nervous system learns patterns faster than the conscious mind. It anticipates danger based on experience. Even silence can become threatening if silence has historically preceded emotional harm. This is why people in toxic relationships often feel worse during calm periods. The body doesn't relax, it braces. It knows what usually comes next. Over time, living this way reshapes identity. People stop trusting their bodies. They stop trusting their instincts. They disconnect from physical sensations because those sensations are overwhelming and confusing. And yet, the body keeps speaking. It speaks through pain, through fatigue, through illness that doesn't respond to standard interventions. This is not weakness. It is adaptation taken too far. What is rarely discussed but deeply important is what happens when the threat is reduced or removed. Clinicians across disciplines have observed something remarkable. When people create distance from chronic relational stressors, the body often begins to heal in ways that previously seemed impossible. Inflammation markers improve. Sleep normalizes. Pain decreases. Energy returns. Not instantly, not magically, but meaningfully, because for the first time, the nervous system is allowed to recalibrate. This doesn't mean the damage disappears overnight. Trauma lives in the body precisely because it accumulates over time. Healing also takes time, but healing cannot begin while the body is still under siege. Emily didn't need her body to be fixed. She needed her environment to be understood. Trauma-informed healing does not ask, "What's wrong with you?" It asks, "What has your body been surviving?" When we reframe chronic illness through this lens, compassion replaces blame, clarity replaces confusion, and the body, finally seen as an ally rather than an enemy, can begin the slow, profound work of repair. Trauma does not live only in memories. It lives in muscle tension, hormone patterns, immune responses, and breath. And until we listen to what the body has been carrying, true healing remains out of reach. What narcissism really is, and what it is not. One of the most dangerous myths about narcissism is that it is obvious. People imagine narcissists as loud, arrogant, self-obsessed individuals who dominate every room and constantly talk about themselves. They picture someone flamboyant, dramatic, and easy to spot. Someone so exaggerated that you would immediately know to stay away. That image is comforting, because if narcissism were that obvious, far fewer people would find themselves slowly unraveling inside relationships they don't understand. Emily didn't think she was dealing with a narcissist. In fact, for a long time, she thought the problem was her. She told herself she was too sensitive, too demanding, too emotional. She believed she needed to communicate better, be more patient, choose her battles more wisely. That belief is not accidental. It is one of the defining psychological effects of narcissistic dynamics. To understand why narcissism is so damaging, we have to strip away the stereotypes and look at what it actually is, quietly, clinically, and relationally. At its core, narcissism is not confidence. It is not ambition. It is not self-esteem. True confidence allows for mutuality. It leaves room for other people's feelings, needs, and perspectives. Narcissism does not. Narcissism is defined by entitlement, emotional shallowness, and a deeply ingrained inability or unwillingness to engage in genuine empathy, not performative empathy, not strategic kindness, but the sustained capacity to care about how another person experiences the world. This is where many people get confused. Narcissistic individuals often appear charming, attentive, and even emotionally intelligent, especially at the beginning. They may listen closely, mirror values, and make the other person feel uniquely seen. Emily remembers feeling chosen, understood, and deeply connected early on. It felt rare, special. What she didn't realize was that this attentiveness was conditional. In narcissism, attention is transactional. It is given when it serves the narcissist's needs and withdrawn when it doesn't. Over time, the relationship shifts from mutual connection to a system where one person's needs dominate and the other person adapts in order to keep the peace. This is why narcissism is so hard to name. It doesn't look like constant cruelty. It looks like inconsistency, like warmth followed by coldness, validation followed by dismissal, connection followed by confusion. Another common misunderstanding is equating narcissism with cruelty for its own sake. While some narcissistic individuals are overtly abusive, many are not consciously malicious. Their behavior is driven by a fragile internal structure, one that cannot tolerate criticism, accountability, or emotional vulnerability. At the center of narcissism is a profound intolerance of shame. Rather than experiencing shame as sadness, guilt, or reflection, narcissistic individuals externalize it. They convert it into anger, blame, or contempt. When something goes wrong, someone else must be responsible. When tension arises, someone else must be at fault. This is why conversations with narcissistic individuals feel circular and exhausting. Problems are never resolved because resolution would require accountability, and accountability threatens their internal equilibrium. Emily noticed this pattern long before she understood it. Every difficult conversation ended the same way. She apologized, even when she wasn't sure what she had done wrong. Her feelings were minimized. Her reactions were scrutinized. The original issue disappeared beneath a layer of defensiveness and reversal. This is not poor communication. It is a structural imbalance. Another critical distinction is that narcissism exists on a continuum. Not everyone who displays narcissistic traits has narcissistic personality disorder. People can be emotionally immature, self-centered, or avoidant without being narcissistic. What differentiates narcissism is persistence, rigidity, and impact. In narcissistic dynamics, the patterns do not change with feedback. They do not soften with time. They do not improve with understanding. The relationship consistently leaves one person feeling confused, depleted, and diminished. And importantly, narcissism is relational. It is not diagnosed by a checklist of traits alone, but by the experience of being in relationship with the person. People like Emily rarely walk into therapy saying, "I'm dealing with a narcissist." They say, "I feel lost. I can't trust myself. I'm always walking on eggshells. I don't recognize who I've become." These experiences are not accidental. Narcissistic relationships are organized around power, control, and emotional asymmetry. One person's needs matter. The other person's needs are negotiable or irrelevant. What narcissism is not is occasional selfishness. It is not a bad week, a stressful season, or a relationship going through a rough patch. Healthy people can be reactive, defensive, or emotionally unavailable at times, and then reflect, repair, and grow. Narcissistic individuals do not engage in genuine repair. Apologies, if they occur, are often vague, conditional, or self-centered. "I'm sorry you feel that way. I guess I'm just a terrible person. You're too sensitive." These statements deflect responsibility while preserving control. One of the most painful realities for survivors is recognizing that narcissistic individuals often function well in the world. They may succeed professionally. They may be admired socially. They may be perceived as generous, intelligent, or charismatic. This external success makes the internal experience even more destabilizing. Emily couldn't reconcile the person others admired with the person who invalidated her behind closed doors. This dissonance deepened her self-doubt. If everyone else thought he was wonderful, maybe she really was the problem. This is how narcissism erodes identity. Not through overt domination, but through subtle psychological disorientation. Understanding what narcissism really is offers something profound: clarity without cruelty. It allows people to stop pathologizing themselves, to stop chasing explanations that never resolve, to see the pattern not as a personal failure, but as a relational structure that was never designed to support mutual well-being. Naming narcissism is not about diagnosing or labeling another person. It is about accurately understanding the environment you are in. And once that understanding settles in, the question quietly shifts from "what is wrong with me?" to "what has this relationship been asking my body and soul to endure?" That shift is the beginning of truth. The many faces of narcissism. Why? Some are harder to spot. One of the reasons narcissism causes so much damage is not because it is rare, but because it is misrecognized. If narcissism always looked loud, grandiose, and overtly cruel, far fewer people would remain entangled in it for years. But narcissism rarely arrives wearing a warning label. It adapts. It disguises itself. It learns what the environment rewards and reshapes itself accordingly. Emily didn't stay because she was naive. She stayed because what she was dealing with didn't match the caricature she had been taught to fear. The truth is this: narcissism has many faces, and some of the most damaging forms are the quietest. What makes narcissism so difficult to spot is not just variety, it's context. The same individual may appear generous in public, supportive in professional spaces, and devastating in private. The behavior shifts depending on where validation is most easily obtained. This is why survivors so often say, "No one would believe me." The first and most widely recognized form is grandiose narcissism. This is the version most people think of when they hear the word narcissist. The confidence is unmistakable. The entitlement is visible. These individuals often dominate conversations, seek admiration, and place themselves at the center of every narrative. And yet, even this form can be deceptively functional. Many grandiose narcissists thrive in leadership roles, public-facing careers, or environments that reward charisma and certainty. Their certainty can be mistaken for competence. Their self-promotion can be mistaken for confidence. Emily encountered this form not at home, but earlier in her career. It was easier to identify, easier to distance from. What came later was far more confusing. Vulnerable narcissism is one of the most misunderstood and overlooked expressions of narcissistic pathology. These individuals do not present as confident or dominant. Instead, they often appear wounded, misunderstood, anxious, or chronically aggrieved. They are the perpetual victims of unfair circumstances, ungrateful people, and bad luck. Their entitlement is not expressed through arrogance, but through resentment. They believe the world owes them something and that others are responsible for their suffering. This form is particularly dangerous because it invites rescue. Emily found herself slipping into the role of caretaker, advocate, and emotional regulator without realizing it. She felt guilty, setting boundaries. She felt cruel for prioritizing her own needs. The narcissism did not feel aggressive, it felt fragile. But fragility can still be controlling. Vulnerable narcissists often rely on guilt, withdrawal, and passive aggression rather than overt domination. They punish through silence, disappointment, and emotional absence. Their suffering becomes a tool, not a state. Another face of narcissism that often goes unrecognized is communal narcissism. These individuals derive their sense of superiority from being seen as helpful, moral, or altruistic. They may appear deeply committed to causes, communities, or service. On the surface, they look selfless, but their generosity comes with strings attached. Validation is required. Recognition is expected. And when admiration is withheld, resentment follows, often directed at those closest to them. Emily noticed how different the energy felt at home compared to public spaces. Outside, there was warmth and charm. Inside, there was judgment, criticism, and emotional distance. The contrast was disorienting. Communal narcissists often hide behind virtue. They frame control as care. They justify harm as doing what's best. And because society celebrates service and sacrifice, their behavior is rarely questioned. Then there is malignant narcissism, the most overtly destructive form. This expression includes manipulation, coercion, and a willingness to harm others to maintain power and control. While not all narcissists are physically abusive, this form carries the highest risk for escalation. Malignant narcissism is easier to identify once the pattern is clear, but extremely dangerous while it is unfolding. Fear replaces confusion. Survival replaces hope. Emily did not encounter this extreme, but understanding its existence helped her recognize that narcissism is not a single experience, it is a spectrum. What all these forms share is not appearance, but impact. Regardless of the subtype, narcissistic relationships leave people feeling smaller, less certain, and increasingly disconnected from themselves. The common thread is not cruelty, it is emotional asymmetry. One person's inner world matters. The other person's inner world must adapt. This is why survivors struggle so deeply with self-doubt. They are often dealing with someone who can switch personas seamlessly. Someone who can be kind one moment and cold the next. Someone who appears reasonable to outsiders and unreasonable only in private. Emily began to notice something critical. The problem was not any single behavior, but the pattern across time. No matter the form narcissism took, the outcome was the same. She was always the one adjusting, apologizing, and accommodating, and the relationship never became safer. This is why checklists fail. You cannot diagnose narcissism from a single interaction. You recognize it by how the relationship feels over time. Do you feel heard or managed? Do you feel supported or tolerated? Do you feel free to be yourself or carefully edited? These questions matter more than labels. Another reason narcissism is so difficult to spot is that it often coexists with genuinely positive traits: intelligence, creativity, humor, generosity. These qualities make the relationship compelling and confusing. People don't want to believe that someone capable of kindness could also cause harm. But complexity does not cancel impact. Emily had to come to terms with a painful truth. Understanding why someone behaves the way they do does not require enduring it. Recognizing the many faces of narcissism is not about becoming hypervigilant or suspicious of everyone. It is about trusting patterns over promises, impact over intention, experience over explanation. Because narcissism rarely announces itself. It reveals itself slowly through erosion, confusion, and the quiet loss of self that happens when a relationship asks you to disappear so it can survive. And once you see the pattern, it becomes impossible to unsee. That awareness is not the end of the journey, but it is the moment the fog begins to lift. The trap. Trauma, bonding, confusion, and self-blame. What keeps people trapped in toxic and narcissistic relationships is not weakness. It is not lack of intelligence. It is not poor judgment. It is a psychological and biological bind so powerful that it can override logic, instinct, and even self-preservation. Emily did not stay because she didn't see the damage. She stayed because every time she tried to make sense of it, her mind became tangled in confusion. Every time she thought about leaving, her body flooded with panic. And every time something went wrong, she somehow ended up believing it was her fault. This is trauma bonding. Trauma bonding is not attachment in the traditional sense. It is not love built on safety, consistency, or trust. It is attachment forged under conditions of intermittent reward and emotional threat. The bond forms through a cycle: idealization, devaluation, withdrawal, and occasional relief. In the beginning, the relationship feels extraordinary. There is intensity, focus, connection. Emily felt chosen in a way she had never felt before. She felt seen, valued, important. That early closeness creates a powerful emotional imprint. Then, slowly, the rules change. Affection becomes inconsistent. Validation becomes rare. Criticism increases. Confusion sets in. But every so often, just often enough, the warmth returns. A kind word. A shared laugh. A moment of closeness that feels like proof that the good version of the relationship still exists. Those moments are not accidental. They are the hook. The human nervous system is especially vulnerable to intermittent reinforcement. It is the same mechanism that keeps people glued to slot machines. When rewards are unpredictable, the brain releases more dopamine than when rewards are consistent. Hope intensifies. Effort increases. Walking away becomes harder. Emily didn't want the relationship to end. She wanted it to go back to how it was. She kept believing that if she could just find the right words, be calmer, be more understanding, things would stabilize again. This is where confusion becomes a prison. Narcissistic dynamics are inherently disorienting. Reality is constantly reframed. Conversations are rewritten. Intentions are questioned. Feelings are dismissed or turned back on the person expressing them. Over time, Emily stopped trusting her perceptions. She replayed conversations in her mind, searching for where she went wrong. She questioned her tone, her timing, her memory. The more confused she felt, the harder she worked to fix the relationship. And the harder she worked, the more exhausted she became. This confusion is not incidental. It is the byproduct of living in a system where accountability is avoided and power is preserved through ambiguity. When nothing is ever clearly acknowledged, nothing can ever be resolved. The result is chronic rumination. People in trauma bonds think constantly about the relationship not because they are obsessed, but because their nervous systems are trying to solve an unsolvable problem. The brain is searching for coherence. The body is searching for safety. Neither finds it. Self-blame is the glue that holds the trauma bond together. Blaming oneself offers the illusion of control. If the problem is me, then I can fix it. If I caused this, then I can prevent it next time. This belief is painful, but it is less terrifying than accepting that the relationship itself is unsafe. Emily told herself stories that allowed her to stay. He had a hard childhood. He's under a lot of stress. I shouldn't have said it that way. I should have known better. She minimized her own pain because acknowledging it fully would have required a choice she didn't yet feel capable of making. This is not denial. It is survival. The nervous system does not prioritize truth. It prioritizes attachment. Leaving a trauma bond can feel like stepping into free fall. Even when the relationship is harming you, it is familiar, predictable in its unpredictability. The idea of losing it can feel like losing oxygen. This is why people often feel physically ill at the thought of leaving. Nausea, panic, dizziness, an overwhelming sense of dread. These are not signs that staying is right. They are signs that the bond is deep. Trauma bonds hijack the body's attachment system. They blur the line between love and relief, between connection and the absence of pain. Emily noticed something that terrified her. Even after particularly painful interactions, she felt drawn back. Not because she felt safe, but because the relief of temporary calm felt addictive. Her body had learned to associate proximity with regulation, even when proximity was the source of distress. Breaking a trauma bond is not about willpower. It is about understanding what the bond actually is. It is not evidence that the relationship is meaningful. It is evidence that the nervous system has been conditioned. This is why well-meaning advice like, "just leave," often fails. It ignores the biological reality of attachment under threat. It shames people for struggling with something their bodies are wired to resist. Healing begins when confusion is replaced with clarity. When Emily began to understand trauma bonding, something shifted. Not immediately, not dramatically, but subtly. She stopped asking why she felt attached and started asking what the attachment had been built on. The answer was not love, it was survival. Naming the trap reduces its power. Understanding that self-blame is a learned response, not a truth, loosens its grip. Recognizing confusion as a signal rather than a flaw changes the narrative. Trauma bonding thrives in silence and isolation. It weakens when experiences are named, validated, and reflected back accurately. Emily didn't break free because she suddenly felt strong. She broke free because she finally understood what she was up against. And that understanding planted the first seed of something she hadn't felt in a long time. Choice. Not the pressure to leave. Not the demand to stay. But the quiet realization that her confusion was not a failure of character. It was the predictable outcome of a system designed to keep her doubting herself. That realization did not end the bond overnight. But it marked the beginning of the end. Why narcissists rarely change. And why that truth hurts. One of the most painful questions Emily carried for years was not why the relationship hurt, but whether it could ever be different. She clung to moments of softness, to promises made during calm conversations, to flashes of insight that felt like breakthroughs. Each time there was a hint of awareness, she felt hope surge back to life. And hope, in narcissistic relationships, is both understandable and devastating. The belief that someone can change is deeply human. We grow through feedback. We learn from mistakes. We adapt when love, loss, or consequence asks us to. For most people, change is uncomfortable but possible. So it makes sense that Emily kept waiting for growth, for accountability, for real repair. The truth is not that narcissistic individuals never change. It is that they rarely change in the ways that matter for relational safety. And understanding why requires us to look at the internal architecture of narcissism itself. At the center of narcissism is rigidity. Healthy personalities are flexible. They can tolerate discomfort long enough to reflect, feel remorse, and adjust behavior. Narcissistic personalities are organized around defense. Their sense of self is built to avoid shame at all costs. Shame is experienced not as an emotion to process, but as an existential threat. When confronted with feedback, especially feedback that suggests harm caused to another narcissistic individuals, experience an internal collapse. Rather than feeling guilt or empathy, they feel attacked. Their nervous systems move immediately into defense. That defense can take many forms: denial, minimization, blame shifting, intellectualizing, or outright rage. What it almost never looks like is sustained self-reflection. Emily saw this pattern repeatedly. Conversations that began with calm intentions ended in reversal. Her pain became the problem. Her reactions became the focus. The original issue disappeared beneath layers of defensiveness. This is not because narcissistic individuals lack intelligence or insight. Many are highly perceptive. They understand social rules. They know how to behave when it benefits them. What they lack is motivation to change in intimate relationships. Change requires accountability. Accountability requires acknowledging impact. Acknowledging impact threatens their internal equilibrium, so the system protects itself. This is why therapy is not the solution many hope it will be. People often believe that if they can just get the narcissistic person into therapy, things will improve. Sometimes there are short-term shifts, a few better weeks, more agreeable language, a temporary increase in insight. But narcissistic individuals do not typically enter therapy seeking to change their narcissism. They come because of external pressure, crisis, or co-occurring issues. They may even use therapeutic language to appear reflective while avoiding actual accountability. Emily noticed how apologies began to sound more polished, but not more sincere. The words changed. The behavior did not. This is the most painful realization for survivors. Insight, without empathy, does not create safety. Narcissistic individuals may intellectually understand what they are supposed to say, but understanding is not the same as caring. And caring is what sustains change when no one is watching. Another reason narcissists rarely change is that, from their perspective, the system works. They often succeed professionally. They may be admired socially. They often secure partners who are empathetic, accommodating, and willing to self-sacrifice. Their needs are met. Their behavior is rarely challenged in meaningful ways. Why change a system that delivers power, validation, and control? Emily's suffering was invisible to the outside world and therefore irrelevant to the narcissistic system. Her pain did not register as a problem unless it interfered with their comfort. This is the harsh truth survivors struggle to accept. Your pain is not enough to motivate change in someone who does not experience it as meaningful. The belief that love can heal narcissism places an unbearable burden on survivors. It suggests that if they just loved better, communicated more clearly, or stayed longer, transformation would occur. But narcissism is not healed by love from another person. It requires internal motivation, humility, and a willingness to confront shame qualities. Narcissistic personalities are structured to avoid. This truth hurts because it shatters hope. Hope is often the last thing survivors hold on to. Letting go of the fantasy of change feels like letting go of the relationship itself and the future that was imagined within it. Emily grieved not just the relationship she had, but the relationship she believed could exist if only the right conditions were met. That grief was profound. It was disorienting. It felt like betrayal by the person, by herself, by the story she had believed. But something unexpected happened when hope dissolved. Clarity emerged. Without the constant question of whether change was possible, Emily stopped negotiating with reality. She stopped waiting for moments that would never become consistent. She stopped interpreting small gestures as evidence of transformation. She began to see the relationship as it was, not as it could be. This shift is not cynicism. It is realism. Understanding that narcissistic individuals rarely change does not mean they are evil or irredeemable. It means their internal structure prioritizes self-protection over mutuality. And mutuality is the foundation of safe relationships. Accepting this truth is not an act of cruelty. It is an act of self-preservation. For Emily, this acceptance was not freeing at first. It was heavy, final, sad. But it was also stabilizing. The constant emotional whiplash ended. The confusion began to settle. She stopped asking, "What if?" and started asking, "What is?" That question changed everything. Because once you stop waiting for someone to become who they are not willing to be, you are finally free to decide who you need to be to survive, and eventually, to heal. And that decision belongs to you, not to the person who refuses to change. Staying, leaving, or managing. The real-world dilemmas. Once the fog lifts and the pattern becomes clear, people often assume the next step is obvious. If you know the relationship is harming you, you leave. That is the story we prefer: clean, decisive, empowering. It fits neatly into motivational language and social media slogans. But real life is not that simple. Emily did not reach clarity and suddenly feel free. She reached clarity and felt terrified. Because clarity did not answer the most difficult question, it created it. What now? Leaving was not just an emotional decision. It was financial, familial, cultural, practical. It involved housing, shared responsibilities, reputations, and consequences that extended far beyond her own well-being. Staying, on the other hand, meant continuing to absorb damage she could now clearly see. This is the reality many people face when they recognize narcissistic dynamics. There is no perfect option, only trade-offs. Staying is often framed as weakness, but in reality, it is often strategy. People stay because they are protecting children, maintaining financial stability, preserving immigration status, avoiding retaliation, or surviving systems that do not support clean exits. Staying does not mean someone has failed to understand the harm. It often means they understand it deeply and are calculating risk. Leaving, while often idealized, can be destabilizing and dangerous, especially when the narcissistic individual does not want the relationship to end. Separation threatens control, narrative, and access to supply. The period after leaving is frequently when manipulation escalates through legal systems, social circles, financial pressure, or smear campaigns. Emily had to confront a truth that few people talk about honestly. Leaving a narcissistic relationship does not automatically bring peace. Sometimes it brings chaos before it brings relief. And then there is the third option: managing. Managing is rarely discussed because it lacks drama. It does not promise transformation. It does not satisfy the desire for a clean moral conclusion. But for many people, managing is the most realistic option in the short or medium term. Managing means radically adjusting expectations. It means no longer seeking emotional intimacy, validation, or understanding from someone who has proven unwilling or unable to provide it. It means interacting strategically rather than vulnerably. For Emily, this was one of the most painful realizations of all. She had to accept that the relationship she wanted, the one built on mutual care, emotional depth, and safety, did not exist. And no amount of explaining, pleading, or waiting would bring it into existence. Managing required a fundamental shift. She stopped treating the relationship as a place to be emotionally nourished and began treating it as an environment to navigate with caution. This did not mean becoming cold or cruel. It meant becoming selective. She shared less, explained less, defended less. She stopped bringing her deepest fears, hopes, and needs into conversations that consistently left her feeling diminished. She built support elsewhere, quietly, deliberately, without announcing it. Managing is not resignation. It is containment. It is saying, this relationship has limits, and I will stop hurting myself by pretending it does not. None of these options, staying, leaving, or managing, are morally superior. What matters is whether the choice increases safety, preserves health, and reduces harm. The pressure people feel to leave immediately often comes from outsiders who do not bear the consequences. They do not live with the financial fallout, the custody battles, the cultural backlash, or the psychological aftermath. Advice is easy when you are not inside the system. Emily learned that no one else could decide for her. Not therapists, not friends, not even people who genuinely cared about her. The right choice was not the most dramatic one, it was the one that aligned with her reality. She also learned that choices are not permanent. Staying now does not mean staying forever. Managing today does not mean never leaving. Leaving does not mean never needing to manage again. These are not single decisions. They are evolving strategies. What matters most is honesty with oneself. Emily asked herself questions she had avoided for years. What does this relationship cost me physically? What does it cost me emotionally? What does it cost me to stay? What does it cost me to leave? Which costs am I willing to bear right now? These questions did not produce easy answers, but they produced clarity. She stopped measuring her choices against other people's expectations and started measuring them against her own capacity. She acknowledged her limits. She honored her timing. One of the most dangerous myths surrounding narcissistic relationships is that there is a right way to exit or endure. In reality, the only wrong path is one that requires ongoing self-betrayal without awareness. Awareness changes everything. When someone stays without understanding, the damage compounds. When someone stays with awareness, they can build protections. When someone leaves with awareness, they can prepare. When someone manages with awareness, they can reduce harm. Emily's decision was not dramatic. It was quiet, incremental, grounded in reality rather than fantasy. She stopped trying to win arguments that were never about truth. She stopped expecting emotional reciprocity where none had ever existed. She began reclaiming herself in small ways through boundaries, through outside connections, through choices that prioritized her nervous system rather than the relationship's demands. And something subtle but profound happened. Even before anything changed externally, she felt stronger internally. Not because the situation improved, but because she stopped arguing with reality. This is the part of the journey few people talk about. The part where empowerment does not look like bold action, but like sober assessment. Where strength looks like restraint. Where healing begins not with escape, but with discernment. There is no universal answer to whether one should stay, leave, or manage. But there is one universal truth. You are allowed to choose the option that protects your health, your safety, and your future, even if that choice does not look heroic to anyone else. Your life is not a cautionary tale for others. It is a lived experience that deserves care. And whatever path you take, it does not define your worth. It reflects your circumstances and your courage to face them honestly. Healing. While the relationship still exists, healing is often imagined as something that happens after an ending. After the door closes. After the distance is created. After the person is gone. But for many people, that version of healing is not immediately available. Emily had to face a difficult truth. Waiting for the relationship to end before beginning to heal was slowly destroying her. Her body could not afford the delay. Her nervous system could not survive another year of suspension. So she learned something counterintuitive and deeply liberating. Healing does not require permission from the person who is hurting you. Healing while the relationship still exists is not about fixing the relationship. It is about reclaiming yourself inside it. This form of healing begins with a quiet shift in focus. Instead of asking, "How do I get them to understand?" the question becomes, "What do I need to stay psychologically intact?" Instead of orienting toward repair, the work turns toward protection. Emily stopped bringing her most vulnerable parts into unsafe spaces, not out of bitterness, but out of self-respect. She realized that continuing to offer her inner world to someone who consistently invalidated it was a form of self-harm she no longer wanted to participate in. One of the first steps in healing was learning to stop going deep. Depth had once felt like honesty, like intimacy, like effort. But in this context, depth only created more openings for dismissal, distortion, and pain. Healing meant recognizing that not every relationship earns access to your interior life. Emily began to keep certain conversations light, practical, surface level. She talked about logistics, schedules, neutral topics. When conflict arose, she responded minimally, not defensively, not explanatorily, just enough to disengage. This was not emotional withdrawal. It was emotional discernment. Another critical component of healing while staying is rebuilding a sense of reality. Narcissistic dynamics erode trust in one's perceptions. Healing requires slowly restoring that trust. Emily began journaling not to analyze the relationship, but to anchor herself in her own experience. She wrote down what happened, how it made her feel, and what her body noticed. Over time, patterns became undeniable. Not because she was looking for them, but because they repeated themselves. This documentation became a quiet ally when self-doubt crept in. Healing also meant creating a parallel support system. Emily stopped expecting the relationship to meet needs it had never met. Instead, she invested in friendships, therapy, creative outlets, and moments of solitude where her nervous system could finally rest. She learned that one safe relationship can do more for healing than years spent trying to repair an unsafe one. This is a crucial reframe. Healing is not about replacing the narcissistic relationship. It is about reducing its centrality. When the relationship stops being the emotional center of your life, its power diminishes. The highs matter less. The lows hurt less. The reactivity fades. Emily also had to confront grief, not the dramatic kind, but the slow, aching grief of accepting what would never be. Healing required mourning the relationship she hoped for, not just the one she had. This grief was not linear. Some days felt heavy, others felt surprisingly light. But over time, grief became less consuming and more clarifying. It marked the end of fantasy and the beginning of realism. Another essential aspect of healing while staying is boundary setting, not as a negotiation, but as an internal commitment. Emily learned that boundaries were not about convincing the other person to behave differently. They were about deciding what she would no longer tolerate internally. She stopped arguing with gaslighting. She stopped correcting distortions. She stopped trying to be understood by someone invested in misunderstanding her. She conserved her energy. This conservation was healing. She also practiced what felt at first like an unfamiliar skill, not personalizing what was never personal. Narcissistic behavior feels intensely personal because it is directed at you, but its origins are not about you. Healing involved separating impact from intent, not to excuse the harm, but to release herself from the belief that she caused it. When criticism came, she no longer searched for the lesson hidden inside it. When withdrawal occurred, she no longer scrambled to restore closeness. She allowed the behavior to exist without absorbing it as a verdict on her worth. This emotional decoupling did not happen overnight. It required repetition, patience, compassion for herself. When old habits resurfaced, healing while the relationship still exists also meant tending to the body. Emily began prioritizing sleep, movement, and moments of calm, not as self-improvement projects, but as nervous system repair. She noticed that even small reductions in emotional exposure had measurable effects: less tension, clearer thinking, fewer physical symptoms. Her body responded quickly to safety, even partial safety. This taught her something profound. The body does not require perfect conditions to begin healing. It requires enough safety, enough predictability, enough validation elsewhere, enough rest from constant vigilance. Perhaps the most radical aspect of healing while staying was redefining success. Success was no longer measured by how well the relationship functioned. It was measured by how well Emily functioned within herself. Did she feel more grounded, more clear, more connected to her own values? Over time, she noticed something she hadn't expected. The relationship did not change, but she did. And that change mattered. She was less reactive, less desperate, less confused. She trusted herself more. She stopped abandoning herself in conversations that went nowhere. Healing did not make the situation ideal, but it made it survivable. And survival, when chosen consciously, can become a bridge to something more. Healing, while the relationship still exists, is not about pretending everything is fine. It is about refusing to postpone your well-being until circumstances become perfect. It is about reclaiming agency where you can, safety where possible, truth internally, even when it cannot be spoken externally. Emily did not wait for permission to heal. She did not wait for an ending. She began where she was. And that choice quietly changed the trajectory of her life, from survival to thriving, reclaiming health, identity, and meaning. Survival is not a failure, but it is not the destination. For a long time, Emily believed that surviving was the best she could hope for. If she could get through the day without conflict, without emotional fallout, without her body shutting down, that felt like a victory. Survival became her metric for success. And in the beginning, survival was necessary. It was adaptive. It kept her functioning when everything inside her was under strain. But survival has a cost. Living in survival mode means your life becomes organized around threat avoidance rather than meaning. Your energy goes into monitoring, managing, minimizing damage. You become skilled at reading moods, anticipating reactions, adjusting yourself. Those skills keep you alive, but they quietly eclipse who you are. Thriving begins when that constant vigilance starts to loosen. For Emily, thriving did not arrive with fireworks. It arrived quietly, in moments she almost missed. A morning where she woke up without dread. An afternoon where her body felt calm, for no particular reason. A conversation where she didn't rehearse her words in advance. These moments were small, but they were unfamiliar. Thriving is not about happiness as a permanent state. It is about capacity. The capacity to feel, to choose, to imagine a future that is not defined by endurance alone. The first thing Emily noticed as she moved out of survival was a shift in her body. The chronic tension softened. Sleep deepened. The constant background anxiety began to fade. Her body, once braced for impact, started to trust that rest was allowed. This was not because her life suddenly became easy. It was because her nervous system was no longer being asked to absorb daily emotional threat. Health returned not as perfection, but as resilience. She still had stress. She still had challenges, but her body recovered faster. She no longer lived in a state of depletion. Energy that had been consumed by vigilance became available for living. As her body stabilized, something else emerged: identity. Survival strips identity down to function. You become what is required of you. Over time, preferences fade. Desires become inconvenient. Self-expression feels risky. Emily realized she had been living without asking herself simple questions. What do I enjoy? What do I want? What feels meaningful to me? And one. Thriving meant reclaiming the right to ask those questions and to answer them without justification. She began rediscovering parts of herself that had gone dormant. Creativity, curiosity, humor, opinions she had once softened or silenced returned. Not loudly, but confidently. This was not rebellion. It was remembrance. Thriving also required grieving what had been lost. There is a temptation to bypass grief in favor of positivity, to frame healing as a victory story. But real thriving includes mourning not just the relationship, but the years spent adapting, the self that learned to shrink, the dreams that were postponed. Emily allowed herself to feel that grief without turning it into regret. She understood that she did what she needed to do to survive. She stopped judging her past self through the lens of present awareness. Self-compassion became a cornerstone of thriving. She forgave herself for not knowing sooner, for staying longer, for hoping harder. She recognized that the qualities that kept her trapped, empathy, loyalty, perseverance, were not flaws. They were strengths misused in the wrong environment. Thriving meant learning to use those strengths where they could flourish. Another profound shift occurred in how Emily related to meaning. In survival mode, meaning is deferred. You tell yourself that once things calm down, once the situation improves, once the conflict resolves, then you will live fully. Life becomes something postponed. Thriving meant bringing meaning into the present. Emily began investing in things that mattered to her now. Relationships that felt reciprocal, work that aligned with her values, experiences that expanded her sense of possibility rather than constricting it. Meaning did not come from erasing the past. It came from integrating it. She discovered that her experience, painful as it was, had sharpened her discernment. She was no longer easily impressed by charm or intensity. She valued consistency, kindness, and emotional safety in ways she never had before. Her standards changed. This is one of the quiet gifts of healing from narcissistic harm. Clarity. Thriving did not mean she never encountered difficult people again. It meant she recognized patterns earlier. She trusted her body's signals. She walked away from dynamics that felt familiar in the wrong way. She no longer confused intensity with connection, or suffering with love. Thriving also meant redefining success. Success was no longer about making relationships work at all costs. It was about living in alignment with her values, about being able to rest, about having space to think, to feel, to grow. Emily stopped measuring her life by how much she could endure and started measuring it by how fully she could inhabit herself. There were still moments of doubt. Healing is not linear. Old fears surfaced at times, but they no longer defined her direction. They were echoes, not commands. Perhaps the most powerful aspect of thriving was agency. For the first time in a long time, Emily felt like her life belonged to her. Not in a dramatic, cinematic way, but in a grounded, embodied sense. She could make choices without bracing for backlash. She could imagine a future without immediately calculating how someone else would react. That freedom was profound. Thriving did not erase what happened. It transformed its meaning. Emily's story did not end with revenge, closure, or perfect resolution. It ended with something far quieter and far more powerful. She became herself again. Not the version shaped by fear, not the version refined by survival, but the version rooted in truth, safety, and self-respect. From that place, life opened. Thriving was not about winning against someone else. It was about no longer losing herself. And that is the kind of ending no narcissistic dynamic can ever take away. A closing reflection. From endurance to awareness. From awareness to choice. Emily's story is not exceptional because it is rare. It is exceptional because it is common and finally named. For years, Emily lived in a state of quiet endurance. Her body carried stress it could not release. Her mind carried confusion it could not resolve. She tried to be patient, understanding, resilient. She believed that if she just tried harder, loved better, or explained herself more clearly, the relationship would stabilize, and the pain would ease. Instead, her health declined. Her sense of self eroded. Her world grew smaller. What ultimately changed Emily's life was not confrontation or escape, but clarity. She began to understand that what she was experiencing was not personal failure, but a relational system that thrived on imbalance. She learned that narcissistic dynamics do not heal through empathy alone, and that chronic emotional stress does not remain emotional. It embeds itself in the body. As Emily gained awareness, something subtle but powerful happened. She stopped fighting herself. She stopped questioning her perceptions. She stopped asking why she felt the way she did, and began asking what her body and mind had been enduring for years. From that place, choice returned. Her journey shows us something essential. Healing is not a single moment, and it does not always begin with leaving. Sometimes it begins with naming reality, with reducing self-blame, with shifting expectations, with learning to protect what is precious inside you, even when circumstances cannot immediately change. The deeper lesson of Emily's story is not just about narcissism. It is about discernment. It is about understanding that love without safety is not love, it is survival. That loyalty without reciprocity becomes self-erasure. That health is not only built in gyms and kitchens, but in the emotional environments we inhabit every day. For the audience listening to this story, the application is not to diagnose the people in your life. It is to listen to your body, your exhaustion, your confusion, your quiet dread or relief around certain relationships. Those signals are not weaknesses. They are information. Ask yourself, do I feel calmer or more depleted after interacting with this person? Am I allowed to be fully myself here? Is my body resting or bracing? Healing begins when we stop negotiating with patterns that consistently harm us and start organizing our lives around psychological safety, truth, and self-respect. Emily's story does not end with perfection. It ends with ownership of her health, of her identity, of her future. And that is available to anyone willing to face reality with compassion instead of self-blame. Disclaimer: this video is for informational purposes only and shares knowledge. It is not a substitute for professional psychological diagnosis or therapy. Quick question for you. Which do you believe is harder but more transformative? A. Gaining clarity about a toxic relationship. B. Taking action after that clarity arrives. Comment A or B below. We'd also love to hear your thoughts. What part of Emily's journey resonated most with you? Or what insight did it spark about your own life? Share your perspective in the comments so others can learn from your experience. And if this content spoke to you, please subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue creating honest, in-depth conversations about narcissism, healing, and reclaiming your life.